Today, we're discussing a burning question in climate. Can we trust carbon credits? And to dig into this, I invited Kees van Santen, founder of Cawa, over to have an honest conversation with me at the campfire. But first, I had him plant a tree, such that we could then raise the crucial question, how do we truly value carbon credits? Kees told me that he discovered that up to 80% of carbon credit money never reaches climate projects. So then where does it go? And how can we solve for this? How can we create trust in this crucial market that's meant to help save our climate? It's a question that led him to found Cawa with a mission to bring transparency to this very opaque market. So join us around the fire as we unravel the carbon credit dilemma.
Yeah.
Hey, Kees.
Hey, Arjé.
So we'll do this in English, of course.
Definitely.
Thanks for being here. Thanks for planting a tree earlier. We're talking about the carbon credit market today, in particular the voluntary carbon credit market.
Mm-hmm.
And I was wondering, before we get started, I just wanted to know, what did you just do there? We took a tree from underneath a much bigger tree. Mm-hmm. So it was basically, it wasn't going to survive long term, right? And we replanted it somewhere else where it had a bigger
chance to grow, basically.
A bigger chance to grow.
Yeah.
So how many credits did you just earn by doing that?
0.
Oh, come on. Really?
0.
0.001.
I mean, in order to get credits, I would have had to do like 2 years of preparation before planting that tree. And 2 years obviously is an average. But in order to get credits for planting trees, growing forests, you would need to register at a standard, make a project plan, get that project plan approved, and go through a couple of certification steps before being able to get credits in the future after planting the tree. So also after planting this tree, there's no carbon sequestered yet. So after a year or 2 years, depending on the size of the tree that you planted, there would have to be like an external auditor that would visit the tree and say, okay, the tree has grown X amount of meters, has sequestered X tons or kilograms of CO2, kilograms in this case.
Okay.
And therefore, with the thousands of other trees that other guests to this podcast planted, there is, let's say, 10 tons of CO2 sequestered in the last 2 years. Therefore, you get 2 carbon credits. So 2 credits for 2 tons of CO2 removed from the atmosphere.
I see.
So there's a lot more to it than just planting a tree.
I see. Yeah. But still, I mean, it's a good idea to plant a tree.
It's a first step. Yeah, it's a first step. And I think when we're speaking about carbon credits, which we're going to speak about today, there are 2 things that we should distinguish. One being the projects or the project activity, and the other being the carbon credits that result from that project. So here we're talking about a project, like a very small 1-tree project. And there could be carbon credits issued later as a result from that project activity, but it doesn't have to be the case. And in this case, it's very unlikely that you will go through the hassle of getting it certified.
I don't know, maybe I should.
I mean, it's a very small plot of land, so for the for the 5 trees that you could plant there, I wouldn't advise it.
Huh. Okay, so I mean, I understand that, but I'm still curious. If you look at the amount of CO2 that we emit on top of what is normal, considering planetary boundaries, I think that number is like 50 something billion tons
Yeah.
of CO2, right? 51, 52. Bill Gates' number.
Yeah.
How much CO2 is this tree going to capture, like on a yearly basis?
Yeah, so an average is like 10 kilograms of CO2 per year for the first 20 years.
Right.
So it's very small.
So we need a lot of trees
Yeah,
to get to the 52 billion
yeah. Yeah,
tons.
definitely. If the only solution were trees, then there should be a lot of trees planted. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. But there are many other solutions, obviously.
Yeah, we'll talk about
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
So let's discuss this market. Right, you are the founder of Cawa, which is a technology company acting in the market of voluntary carbon credit
Yeah.
purchasing and selling. Right. You could, let's talk about the markets first.
Yeah.
Like what is that carbon credit market, and what is the voluntary carbon credit market?
Yeah. Yeah, so there are two types of carbon credits. So credits that are traded on the voluntary carbon market and on compliance markets. So as we're taping in the Netherlands, the compliance market in the EU is the EU ETS. That market gives carbon credits to emitters, so for instance, oil companies, steel manufacturers, etc., and reduces the amount of credits that they get each year. And if they emit more than the amount of credits that they get, they would have to buy it from others in that same market. So the idea is, if we reduce the amount every year, the total amount emitted will decrease with, let's say, a few percentage points each year. That is completely different than the voluntary carbon market. So both are called carbon credits, but it's a completely different setup. On the voluntary carbon market, there's a project, so it could be an afforestation project where there are thousands and thousands of trees planted just like we did. And from that project activity, you get carbon credits after the carbon is removed from the atmosphere. So every 2 years, there's this auditor going to the project site and not literally measuring every tree if it's like tens of thousands of trees, but doing a sample and saying, okay, this is the amount of tons of CO2 removed. There are carbon credits issued for that, and those carbon credits can be bought by companies that want to compensate for their CO2 emissions.
Okay, so you only get the credits after the carbon capture has happened.
Yeah.
It's not like I can issue a credit based on the planting of the tree by itself.
No.
Uh-huh.
So it is after the fact, and that obviously has the impact that you know more about, like, did the project activity actually happen, and did it have the results that you wanted to have. And for the, you have to see it as a project. So if you are planting thousands and thousands of trees, that costs money, and you have to, you know it because you run a forest. Also, you have to maintain the forest, you have to clear trees, etc., in order to let the forest grow. So there's money involved in also maintaining that for a longer period. So if you have a new project, then you raise money to plant all the trees, to buy, lease, or whatever, rent land. And you can make a business case based on the carbon credits that you will sell in the 30 years after that. And you obviously can model that, but there's obviously deviations from the exact amount that will be suppressed.
So the business case is for me, and then I still have to do that investment.
Yeah.
I only get the credits after the carbon has been captured.
Yeah.
Okay, so I didn't know that, and I'm pretty sure that for lots of people, this entire carbon credit business is very intransparent. I know you like that word, right? Or rather, you like transparency. So So what's the problem with this carbon credit market and the voluntary carbon credit market? Why isn't it flying yet, or is it?
I mean, it is flying. It has been around for a couple of decades now. So there are a lot of actors involved in the market. There are project developers. There are standards that set out methodologies for these projects. There are intermediaries. There are buyers, etc. So it is a market that is alive, but it should grow with, I don't know, 100x, 1000x from today in order to have the real impact that it should have.
And okay, so now we get to the obvious question: how is Cawa going to solve for this?
Yeah, there are a couple of problems in the market at the moment. So you touched upon that already, and there are two key ones. So one, it is super intransparent where your money goes, and two, there are many low-quality carbon credits out there. So, and these two issues we're trying to tackle with Cawa. And in general, those two issues contribute to a lack of trust in the market. So if there's more trust, more people will put their money in it, and it will grow.
Hold on, so you say low-quality carbon credits.
Yeah.
What's that?
Yeah, so as I said, there are two things. So there's the projects and there's the carbon credits that result from the project. So I think these things are mixed many of the time in discussions. And you can have really great projects with not so great carbon credits. And it's hard to get like very low quality projects and very good carbon credits. But obviously you want to have both.
What is a not great carbon credit?
So in order to compensate for your emissions, you want that carbon credit to be, for instance, additional. So with additionality, it is meant that carbon credits played a crucial role in establishing the project. So without carbon credits, the project would not exist.
I see. Okay.
And it can still be a great project because there are trees planted and there's a lot of impact and the local community benefits and all that kind of stuff. So the project can be great, but the carbon credits can be not additional. So that's what I mean with the difference between the two.
So this concept of additionality, can you say a little bit more about that? When is that happening? Oh my goodness, talking about carbon credits, right? So what has to happen for a project to be additional?
Yeah. So the easiest explanation is that what I just said, like a project shouldn't or wasn't going to exist without the financing of carbon credits.
Yeah.
And with some projects it's really clear because it's the only source of financing. And with other projects it's not so clear because, for instance, in a forest you can also sell the timber or sell products of the forest. So there could be additional revenue streams that make it less clear that there is additionality of a carbon credit. And the most striking case to make an example out of that is previously, let's say 20 years ago, 25 years ago, renewable energy projects, so solar, wind projects, were deemed in many cases additional under the large standards. And they are not at the moment. So
why is that?
Because there's a lot more financing available. The cost of these projects is much lower because the cost of solar panels has decreased over the last decades. And in many of the developing countries, there's just a lot more financing available. So issuing carbon credits to make that project happen is not really the case in many of those countries.
Yeah, okay, so you also mentioned to me previously that like the whole idea of these carbon credits and the market around it was to kind of bootstrap these projects.
Yeah.
Is that right?
Yeah, not sure if you would call it bootstrapping, but to make these projects happen.
Right.
Yeah.
And otherwise they wouldn't happen. And that's the definition of the additionality?
Yeah.
I see. Okay.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that's a key concept, and it's something that relates to the carbon credits specifically and doesn't relate to the impact of the project. And I think that's something that people confuse a lot of the times, because they say, yeah, but this project is great, it has this and this impact, why are there no carbon credits issued for it? And I think it's really important to have those two things separate. So for instance, if you now look at a renewable energy project in, let's say, Zambia, it's a great project. It's good that it's built in many of the cases, but there shouldn't be carbon credits issued for that project.
I see.
And,
Okay.
and that's something that the standards, so Verra and Gold Standard are two of the larger standards
Major
in
ones.
in the industry. They now said, okay, these new projects that want to issue carbon credits from these countries, they cannot go through the Verra or Gold Standard certification process anymore.
So let's fast forward a little bit, because I got to get this out of the way. There are a lot of, there's a lot of criticism on this idea of carbon credits. If someone comes to you and they say, well, carbon credits is just an excuse, it's a free pass for the big companies. Now you're going to say, well, there's voluntary and non-voluntary, but what do you say when someone challenges you on this?
It depends what exactly they challenge me on.
The whole concept of carbon credits.
I think the key thing is, what are you trying to do with the carbon credits? So carbon credits in itself is a tool to finance these projects. So there are two things to argue about. Like, one is the goal that you have with the tool, is that worthwhile? That could be something to argue about. Or is the tool the right tool? Those are two things to argue about.
Well, I think that in the perception of people, myself included, the goal of carbon credits is for the big companies to pay for the additional emissions that they have, that they should actually be lowering. But you're saying, no, that's not the goal. The goal is to fund these projects.
I think eventually, if you look at a net zero goal, the net stands for that you are compensating something.
Yeah.
Otherwise, it would be a zero goal.
Yeah.
You would have zero emissions.
Yeah.
So it's inherent that something is netting out. And the netting out could happen via lots of tools, but the tool that is now available in the market are carbon credits. So you could obviously remove tons of CO2 out of the atmosphere in a different way, but the goal is to net out these emissions. And we can discuss the goal. For me, that's very clear, but maybe for others it isn't. And then we could discuss the tool to get to that goal. So the tool is carbon credits.
Hey, Kees, you mentioned the word trust a couple of times. Right? You said that we need trust in the carbon markets.
Yeah.
Why are you saying that?
Because I think that we need to scale the carbon markets in order to get to the goals in all the IPCC reports and the goals that we have as a world, basically.
And what's the problem with trust at the moment?
Well, it's basically the question that you asked. Like you said, I think that carbon credits, something like that, I think that carbon credits are a way for big companies to get away with their emissions. That is something, like one of the aspects of a lack of trust in the market. It's not something that you're not saying like, okay, I'm going to buy carbon credits tomorrow because you think it's something like a scheme from the big companies,
right,
trying to get out.
I'm sure lots of people think that.
Yeah, and I think the interesting thing is, one, it's a voluntary market. So the easiest thing for companies would be to do nothing and not engage in the market. because they don't have to. So I think it's quite an elaborate way of getting out of something to get that whole market to blow up, basically, to get out of your responsibility for your CO2 emissions.
And why would a company participate in it? What's the benefit?
I think there are three main benefits for a company. One, a lot of companies set carbon neutral, net zero like goals. And in order to get there, at some point, they have to compensate for their emissions. Because even if you eliminate all your air travel and if you switch to electric cars, etc., there will, in a lot of the cases, still remain a part of emissions related to your company. So at that point, if you really want to go to zero, if you want to cancel out your emissions, that's when you should go to carbon credits or something similar in order to get CO2 out of the atmosphere.
And basically they would do that because marketing?
Yeah, marketing, really wanting to do good in the world. Might sound really crazy, but
yeah.
That is something that actually a lot of companies actually want.
Yeah.
So it's marketing and doing good for the world and having to comply with the own set goals that they made.
And the companies that you're working with, are their customers really asking them to do this?
Sometimes. I think in general, customers want to buy goods and services from companies that have a positive, sustainable image, and carbon credits can be a part of that. I don't think that there are many customers that really say, company X, I want you to buy this type of carbon credits from this market, otherwise we won't buy your goods. So it's more indirect.
So you mentioned you're working with a coffee company, a producer of coffee beans, and they are very proud of the fact that they are net neutral, which is kind of, it's only possible with those credits, you're saying, right? Without mentioning the name of the company, obviously. Is it a good example, or is there another one that we should use?
It's not a good example, but I'm trying to see what what you want to.
Then we'll use a different example.
Yeah. What do you want to explain?
So do you have an example of a company, a customer or otherwise, that is really embracing these voluntary carbon credits? Mm-hmm. And why are they doing it?
I think the key aspect, I have an example. So there's a company that has locations throughout the Netherlands, so physical locations like co-working spaces, etc., where they really want to make a positive impact with their company. So they did everything. So they calculate their carbon footprint, so they take reduction measures, improve the sustainability of their buildings, fleet, etc., everything. And they saw eventually that there are still emissions related to their buildings. So they use carbon credits to neutralize basically the emissions that are related to their buildings. And the funny thing is that was the first time that actually the carbon emissions got a price. So you also saw sort of a feedback loop in the company, like, hey, there is 10 tons of CO2 emitted in this particular building that now costs us X amount, and we should reduce further because now we have to pay every month this particular amount.
This additional cost.
Yeah. So it's.
And are they acting on it?
Yeah, they're acting on it. So that's interesting to see that a ton of CO2 is quite abstract. And if you put a price to it, it becomes a real thing.
Right. Tell me about those projects. So you mentioned that you've evaluated about 150 different carbon projects.
Yeah.
Can you give us an example of a really great one that you're particularly fond of?
Yeah, so maybe one thing, so we're always using the example of trees and afforestation because it's easy to explain, everybody gets it, but there are many types of climate projects. But I will still use a tree example because then, then everybody knows what I'm talking about. So we're working with a climate project that operates throughout East Africa, and what they do is they work with lots and lots of local farmers in order to plant trees on degraded land that they have. And so they train the farmers how to plant trees, what trees to plant on specific soil. They help them monitor the growth. They help them maintain the trees over time. They give them the seedlings or the small trees that they're planting. And with that, they have created immense impact all over East Africa. And the interesting thing is that these farmers plant trees. Some of the trees are also fruit-bearing trees, so they can get fruits out of the trees, basically. And second is that there is a benefit-sharing agreement. So once carbon credits are sold, a percentage of the carbon credits sold gets back all the way to the farmer. So they do something different than, for instance, cattle grazing on a specific piece of land. They get fruits from that.
Yeah, so it's multiple benefits coming from the same
project.
And to get back to the additionality, if this project wouldn't exist, then this land would simply just be degraded and nothing would really change.
That would be the baseline.
Right. So by funding this project, something material is changing with this land, and also in the situation for the farmers.
Yeah. And I think the interesting thing is like the combination of the carbon credit money getting to the farmer also creates an incentive for them to keep the trees growing on their land and to maintain it, etc. Because otherwise you get your auditor going to the specific site, and if there are no trees anymore, then there's no carbon credits, and then there's no carbon credit money flowing to them.
Yeah, yeah. So it's also a longer term.
Yeah, that's the idea.
So what is your origin story with carbon markets? Where are you coming from? How did you come up with this idea of starting this business? When was the moment you thought, okay, I got to do something with this?
I mean, there's an origin story on like the climate side for me. So working on the climate issue in the broader sense. So when I was studying in Delft, I was always focusing on renewable energy.
What did you study?
Systems, I cannot even pronounce it.
What's that?
No, it's systems engineering, policy analysis and management.
Yeah, makes sense.
And it's basically a lot of words for a combination of scientific type of courses and business type of courses. So you're always looking at the intersection of basically the TU Delft world and the business world. And a part of that at that time was renewable energy being not a new thing, but like coming up. And so from the start of my studies, I always focused on renewable energy as a key aspect of my studies. So you had to choose after 6 months, what track you were going to do for the other 4.5 years. And for me, that was clearly the focus on energy, renewable energy. So that was always the path also later in my work, basically. So it's always been renewable energy, and later on it went into broader into climate and sustainability as a whole.
But then, okay, so when was the moment you thought, okay, I need to start a business and I have to do something about this voluntary carbon credit market?
Yeah, there was actually before I started with Cawa, there was, I think, a year before, there was the moment when I was sitting with a friend and discussing specifically tree planting and how to get tree planting on a larger scale. So basically thinking about the different ways of incentivizing tree planting. And that could be through donations, that could be through carbon credits, that could be through all kinds of other stuff. And we actually thought about that issue, like, okay, how do we get trees planted at a larger scale? And it was basically because we looked at a specific company that was planting trees, and my friend was a CEO of a scale-up, and he wanted to do something good. He engaged with that company, and then he saw like, oh, they're making really not that much impact. Like, it's really small scale. And how can we do it on a much larger scale? And do we have to buy land everywhere? Do we have to set up something really big in order to make a lot more impact? So that's when the idea started we didn't do anything with that specific idea or with that brainstorm, which was like a couple of weeks, I think. But that sort of started the idea of initially for, okay, doing something in the carbon credit or in the carbon space.
So it's a way for you to do something about this at scale.
Yeah, and I think that's the key thing. Like, we can plant a few trees and have nice marketing about it and have feel really good about ourselves, but eventually to solve climate issues we need to do it at scale, and therefore the carbon credit market is a tool to finance climate action at scale. So that was basically when I first started to think about that, and before that I lived, as I said, like when we were walking through the forest, I lived and worked in Tanzania for a while, and the company I was working for was selling off-grid solar home systems. So for the house, like here. So we were selling that in rural Tanzania, Kenya, Rwanda, etc. And obviously, like there's also a lot of other climate projects around that area. And so eventually we also sold clean cook stoves, which is a very typical carbon credit project. And we got listed on the gold standard as well. Yeah. So there were carbon credits issued from the project I was working for. And at that time, as I said, there are two things to think about, like the climate project and the carbon credits. At that time, I was much more focused on the climate project and I was not focused on the carbon credit side. Yeah. But obviously, it gives the reality on like what do these projects do on the ground, and how, like, what does it entail to set up something in rural parts of Africa, and how to get impact again at scale.
So this wasn't your first plant, your first tree that you planted?
I think it was my first tree that I planted.
Right, good. Okay, so you were in Africa, you were working on this project, and then the origin of Cawa. How old is the company now? Like 1.5 years, 2 years?
Yeah, 2 years.
2 years?
Yeah.
When was the moment you thought, okay, this is a business?
I started to speak on a weekly basis with my co-founder, and we had this idea around, it wasn't necessarily carbon credits at the beginning, so I think that's interesting as well for our discussion on it's a tool. So what we wanted to do is to fund climate action in a transparent way. So right now, if you compensate for a specific good or service online, it feels like your money goes into a black box. So you add 10 euros in whatever checkout, and there it ends. Yeah. So you have
this is when I was on a plane this year for the first time in a long time, by the way. And I booked my ticket at at the agency, and I had this option to compensate for my CO2 emissions. So that moment when I tick that box,
Yeah.
I have no idea where that money is going to go.
Yeah.
And it's such a downer, right? And I'm sure many people don't tick that box. Why would you? And are you helping kind of mitigate for that?
Yeah, so that was where the initial idea came from. Like, okay, where's that money going? Does it eventually end up at a climate project? How much of it? What is the impact? Like, what is happening, basically? So we thought about a way to, with technology, just show literally like, okay, from my 10 euros, how much ends up where, at what time, and what is the impact of that?
Yeah.
So that was the core idea. And then we looked into a way, okay, so the money flow is the first part. That's the technical part. And my co-founder is the CTO. So he could think about like a whole...
Geeking out about it?
Yeah, there's something to work on. And the impact side, we thought about, okay, what if we integrate with... what if we make donations to specific climate projects? And how can we verify the impact that was made? Because eventually our geeky minds were like, okay, you want to contribute an amount of money and you want to know how much CO2 was removed.
What percentage of that money actually flows towards the CO2 capturing, and how much of it is kind of stuck in the middle?
Yeah, so there are two things, like the money flow and what is the impact of your money.
Right.
And
so are you able to quantify that?
Yeah, I mean, that's the whole thing of carbon credits. So that's why we went to carbon credits, because there's already a whole way of quantifying what CO2 is removed from the atmosphere or reduced. So that's how we got to that side. And that's why we are not engaged in tree planting projects that say, okay, I'm exaggerating a bit, but like say, okay, Kees planted a tree over there. That is 10 kilograms a year. So now you pay for it, because you don't know what's going to happen. Maybe Arjé is going to take out that tree tomorrow and he's going to let it replant by his next podcast guest.
Well, it does. I mean, we took the tree from underneath another tree.
Yeah.
And when we dug it out, I'm sure we messed with the roots.
Yeah.
And so the question is it going to be able to
survive? Yeah.
To survive.
Yeah.
We don't really know.
Yeah. And that's why when we looked at donation type of project,
right,
it was really hard for us to quantify the impact and make that, because we were geeking out about it, like make that transparent to the end buyer. And that's why I'm saying, like, it's not that the project is bad, because it could be that you are growing a beautiful forest and I planted the first tree.
Yeah.
It's just really hard to quantify and therefore to prove that it actually happened.
Yeah.
So that's when we shifted from, okay, we're giving money to charity to plant trees and do other stuff,
right,
to carbon credits, because there's a whole,
there's a system around it
to quantify the impact.
Right. So if I would sell a credit based on you planting this tree, that's what you said in the beginning. I would have to jump through all kinds of hoops to get someone here, like in a year's time, to measure the impact that was created by you planting the tree.
Yeah.
And only then I would be able to sell the credit.
Yeah. So there's a lot more.
So it's actually a very solid system, is what you're saying.
Yeah, in theory, it's a very solid system.
In theory.
Yeah. Because obviously, like, if it were all super clear, then there wouldn't be a use for Cawa. If it was just like super solid, super transparent, super well structured, etc. That's not the case at the moment, and that's why Cawa has a reason to live.
Okay, cool. Let's dive into the technicalities a little bit. You mentioned your co-founder being a CTO now. He's not here, but explain to us what's the technical solution that you provide with Cawa?
Yeah, so in essence, it's really simple. We connect a buyer to a climate project. We track the money flowing from that buyer to the climate project, and we give the carbon credit or the proof of the carbon credit, we give it back to the buyer, and we automate all that. That is basically the core of our platform. So you do a transaction and you get a proof back. That's one part, and then we have a layer of APIs on top of that that makes it possible to integrate that into, well, in the future, the checkout for your flight, maybe.
Right.
Or into a platform that calculates the carbon footprint of a company, or into XYZ. So that's at the very basic level is what we've built.
Yeah, so as a consumer, I wouldn't be buying these credits from you. I would be buying them from some other company that integrates with you, right? Like the
Yeah,
airplane
could be done in both ways.
company.
Yeah.
Right. And so who are your target customers?
So we've obviously, as it is a set of APIs, you can do it in, you can plot that use case in many different areas. What we've done until now is we integrate with carbon accounting platforms. So basically platforms that calculate the carbon footprint of a company. And in all these platforms, there is a way to calculate the footprint. There is reduction measures that they advise you to take. And then in the last step, there is an option to compensate for your residual emissions. And in the back end, that is powered via our APIs. So that is that core use case. And these platforms, they want to work with us because one, it is something completely different than calculating a company's footprint, is scouting, vetting, analyzing all these climate projects, and then also making deals with them. So it is something that is really not their core business, but it's interesting for them to integrate with us because there's a lot of reporting regulation, also in Europe, for instance, with CSRD, and they want to have the carbon credit data basically also inserted into the sustainability reporting of a company.
Right.
So that's for them an interesting solution to add to their platform.
And this reporting, for how many companies is this relevant? What kind of companies should be doing
so it's companies. There's a couple of thresholds. So it's from 250 employees. That's, I think, the easiest way to...
That's the current European Union...
Yeah, that's for a CSRD. So it's a lot more companies than used to have to report on sustainability. So for a lot of companies, this is the first time actually that they're doing sustainability reporting in a really rigid way.
Right.
And it is quite heavy on some companies. So that's why they work with these platforms to help them also with preparing for this regulation.
And this number of 250 employees, is that going down, or is that...
That is it for now, and it might go down over time, but 250 employees is the...
It's not like a mom and pop shop is going to have to do this kind of reporting in the future?
No, because that would be quite insane because it's really a lot of work.
Yeah.
So I don't think that would happen, but it could go to, 100 employees or another threshold.
Okay, so if you, you're a founder. Many founders have a really hard time sleeping, relaxing in general.
Yeah.
What keeps you up at night, if at all?
there are two things related to Cawa that keep me up at night. I think the main thing is that I see things not going fast enough. So I see that if you zoom out, then everybody agrees, like that is a bit in the market or knows something about sustainability, that eventually you need to have carbon removal on a large scale. But everyone assumes implicitly that we're gonna magically go from 0 to 100.
Right.
So for the carbon removal industry to scale to the levels that we need in 2030, in 2040, 2050, we need investment now, because there's not going to be like a magical, really huge carbon removal industry alive if it's not being financed at this moment, because it will not evolve in a few months. So I think
and you're saying that this is why we have to do the credits, right? Because we have to invest in these kinds of projects.
Yeah, I mean, if everyone wants to donate their money to these type of projects, also fine by me. But we have to finance these type of projects in order to be ready very fast, in order to remove enough CO2 from the atmosphere.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of people are missing that. And I think a lot of companies are like, oh yeah, I have my net zero goal in whatever, 2040, and I'll just figure it out by then. And in that way, we don't channel enough finance to the projects that we need, and we will just sort of miss the boat.
Right.
And I think that realization, it is not necessarily related to carbon credits specifically, but just to the whole concept of net zero on a specific date.
And this is what keeps you up at night.
Yeah, sometimes.
And you're going to solve this with Cawa?
We'll try to add to solving that, yeah.
So let's think about 2040. You just mentioned 2040 as a date. Mm-hmm. So if you're wildly successful with Cawa, what does that world look like?
I hope somewhat similar to today. But I think that companies will be held accountable for their carbon footprint. At the moment, many companies are not. So I think that for every ton emitted, there will be a ton removed from the atmosphere. And there are many ways of how that can be done. But if we're focusing on carbon credits and the market that we are in, I think that there will be, every transaction will be coupled to a carbon footprint of that transaction. So a transaction for a glass or a transaction for something else. And that a company will have to compensate for that footprint one way or another. So it can be on a product level or on a company level. That's all technicalities.
And you're going to be in between these transactions every single time?
Yeah, that's the idea. Because eventually we want to make it affordable and easy for those companies to integrate those CO2 compensation actions into their business.
And that's how you're going to make a living?
Yeah. Eventually.
So you're taking money away from the actual projects?
Yeah, so that's not how we see it, obviously.
Well, I mean, it's business, right? So you got to make a living.
Yeah.
I got that. But
no, so how we see it is that at the moment, if you have your company and you buy carbon credits on the market, it is super intransparent where your money goes. So you buy your carbon credit, and eventually you want as much of your money as possible to go to a climate project. But because the market is super obscure and intransparent at the moment, we see that by far the majority of the money goes to middlemen. So
How much is that
yeah, so
percentage-wise?
yeah, obviously because it's obscure, it's hard to get that data.
Yeah.
But we see many examples where like 80% of the money, 85% of the money goes to intermediaries.
Really?
And there are two ways that can be done. So one, it is one intermediary just buying a carbon credit for a couple of euro and selling it for
Right,
tens of euros.
margin on top, yeah.
But then like not like 10%, but like 80% on top.
But aren't you doing the same thing?
No, because that's the key of that's how we started out. You want to know how much money ends up where.
Yeah.
So we take a fee and we show exactly how much of the money that was transferred eventually ends up in the bank account of the climate project. So we couple the bank account of the climate project to our software. So,
Okay.
Eventually you can always see how much of your euros goes to the climate project and how much ends up at what date where.
Like with the farmer?
That's the next step, and that's funny that you say that, because now we have the flow all the way to the climate project, which is happening in very few cases in the market right now. But we're actually speaking to the companies that work on dispersing the money to the farmers. So you can imagine, like, if you have 10 participating farmers, you can just send them the money. But if you have tens of thousands of farmers, then you need to have a system for that. So we have one of our projects is working with a software provider that disperses that money. And we want to integrate with them so we can show it all the way to the farmer. So you can literally see, like, your euro went from you to the climate project to the farmer, and this is how much ends up percentage-wise at that group of farmers. So that's the next step.
So ultimately you provide this kind of transparency to your customers.
Yeah.
And ideally the consumer eventually. So they get to really see where their money is going and the impact it has.
Yeah.
Wonderful.
And that's the idea, and that's what we're working on.
What's the so do you have a metric that you use to quantify Cawa's impact as a business?
Yeah, I think that's the key thing of carbon credits, because one carbon credit is 1 ton of CO2 removed or reduced. We didn't speak about reduction credits, but
what's that? Are they different? Reduction credits?
Yeah, so they're actually called avoidance credits. So you basically avoid that 1 ton of CO2 is released into the atmosphere.
I see.
So with Cawa, we only focus on carbon removal.
Yeah.
But for instance, if you build a renewable energy plant, you are not taking CO2 out of the atmosphere with the building, like with the impact of renewable energy, like a solar plant or a windmill. So what you do is you reduce the emissions from a coal plant. That's the rationale behind it. Or, for instance, if you conserve a forest, then you protect it from people that cut down the trees or burn the forest or do something else. So those are avoidance credits.
And do you deal with those as well?
No. And that is because
is it a different market, or
it's the same market, so it's all under carbon credits. And we don't deal with it because of a few reasons. One, it is a lot harder to quantify the impact. And you've also seen that in the scandals around the carbon credit market. So usually if there's a headline, it says carbon credits in general, and there's no...
Right. There's no
distinction between the two.
Right.
But many of the articles in the last 1 or 2 years have been about conservation projects. So the conservation of rainforest, for instance. And the key fact why, I mean, there's a lot written about it, but the key fact why it is difficult is because you have to make, as they said, a counterfactual baseline. So you have to say, okay, with this project, I will protect the rainforest. And if I wouldn't have done that, there would be, let's say, 10% cut down or burned every year.
Right.
And it has just proven that it's just really difficult to quantify that in a meaningful, robust way.
Which is why you're focusing on the type of credits that are actually measured.
Better to, like, relatively easier to quantify.
Right.
And also, so that's one reason. And the other reason is that eventually we need to move from avoidance credits to removal credits in order to get to the net zero goals.
Yeah. Makes sense. All right, so your impact metric for the company is simply the number of credits that you...
Yeah, it's tons of CO2.
That flows through your system.
Yeah, it's tons of CO2, yeah.
Tons of CO2.
Yeah, and eventually we will also look into other metrics because many of the projects have co-benefits, as they're called. So obviously, when you plant a lot of trees, you also have local community working for your forests. So you increase their income. You can maybe educate them
Social
as part
standards.
of the project. So there's a lot of other SDGs impacted with most of the projects.
Right. Yeah.
And eventually we also want to quantify them. So we can not only talk about carbon, but also talk about the other benefits.
Kees, you're literally sitting in the smoke here. Carbon is all around us. So you planted this tree, right? 10 kilograms of CO2 sequestered every year. I think this was, I don't know, how much was there in that tin?
Not sure.
20, 30 kilos? But there's still some water in it. It's not 100% carbon, is it?
No, it is not 100% carbon, no.
So how many years of growth for that tree to get this out of the air again? What do you think?
This is more like an estimation question because I'm not going to really quantify it. But it will take a long time. I mean, you've seen like the really small tree that we planted.
Yeah.
So...
And that tree was about 5 years old, I guess.
Yeah, and I think that the key thing is that today I saw on the national news, I saw that there was this article about the impact of deforestation in the last year. And just the amount of deforestation is so huge that... Globally. Yeah, in the Netherlands there are hardly any trees left. So, we have to do a lot to conserve and to replant trees. And obviously, as I said, have other carbon removal projects set up. And now you're sitting in the smoke.
No, yeah, absolutely. All right, so let's fast forward to 2040. Again, what does Cawa look like? Are you going to expand into additional products and businesses? How do you see yourself? I mean, if you're being successful, eventually Cawa wouldn't have a purpose anymore, wouldn't it?
I think there will always be, or at least for the foreseeable future, there will be a way for companies to pick specific carbon credits through a middleman, because a lot of companies will not have the manpower basically to dive into all these projects and pick the ones that work best for them, etc. So companies want an easy solution, and that easy solution can be Cawa. on your other question, like how do we evolve? What we're doing now, as I also said, like with the complete connection from the buyer to eventually the farmer, is that you basically connect that whole chain. And there are a lot of things that we can develop to make that whole chain work better. So, for instance, at this moment, you have climate project developers that still manage a lot of their carbon credits and the inventory of those carbon credits manually. So as we automate our whole back end, basically, we can also offer them ways to automate their side of carbon credit inventory, carbon credit retirement. So that's the cancellation of a credit in the name of a company. And that whole flow, basically. So I see that we can develop a couple of new products that fit on top of our infrastructure.
Yeah, so you've got a long way to go, right? It's not going to be done overnight.
No, definitely, and I think it's still relatively early days for the voluntary carbon market, and that's why it's possible for actors to ask for insane markups, right?
Yeah.
There's no grown-up market where you can easily get away with like an 80% margin on top of a project.
That's ridiculous.
Yeah.
That's a real thing?
That's a real thing, yeah.
Crazy.
So there are two things there. As I said, like one, it's somebody asking for like 6 times the price they bought it for.
Yeah.
And then there's the second thing, which is an intermediary buying from another intermediary, buying from another intermediary, and everybody adding their fee on top of the credit.
Yeah, you can't see what's going on.
And you can't see what's going on. So you don't know as a buyer how much money ends up at the climate project that will eventually do the work.
This realization that it's such an intransparent market kind of works the other way around as well, right? For you.
Mm-hmm.
Like, you know, your buyer could be, you could facilitate greenwashing for your buyer. How do you deal with that? Is that something that happens?
Yeah, I mean, it has definitely happened in the market. So it's interesting to pose the question back to you, like, what do you see as greenwashing? First, to get that out of the way.
Well, for me, greenwashing is, whenever a company is painting this picture that they're carbon neutral, and I can't really tell whether it's true or not, right? But I guess that goes back to this transparency thing that you're so keen on. And as a consumer, I just I can't differentiate, right, between companies that use greenwashing for marketing and those that invest in, as you call them, good projects or high quality projects that really make a difference. I don't know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think the key thing in distinguishing between greenwashing and actual climate action or good intentions is basically around the transparency around all that. And in Europe...
So you're going to solve this problem?
I think this will already be solved by regulation. So in Europe, you have the Green Claims Directive coming up, and you also have national variations on that directive that will basically say this is what you can say and this is what you cannot say as a company around your sustainability efforts.
Yep.
And it will get clearer and more elaborate over time, but it's really clear to me that, let's say 5 years ago, you could get away with really bold claims that didn't have much substance. At the moment, you can get away with some things, and in 3 to 5 years it will be way harder to get away with greenwashing claims, because you cannot make any claim anymore. You cannot make just a claim, and if you make a claim, you have to give transparency on, okay, how did you get to this claim? If it's with carbon credits, what carbon credits did you use? And are they of high quality? How much did you invest, etc. So it will still happen.
Is this a European Union
Yeah.
regulatory process, or is this something that's happening globally?
The Green Claims Directive is from the EU.
Yeah.
But there are more similar trajectories happening across the world. And in most cases, like with sustainability regulation, Europe is, or the EU is leading the way.
Is it?
Yeah.
Cool.
So, like in 3 to 5 years, I see the risk of greenwashing way less than it is now. And now I already see the risk as less than a few years ago.
So just keep plowing on, keep doing it.
Yeah, I think so. And for us specifically, there's even less risk at the moment for us to engage in greenwashing. Yeah. So one, obviously we ask companies, hey, what are your sustainability plans before we work with them?
Right.
So is this part of like a real strategy, or is it just a quick way out? And the other thing is, because we offer higher quality, newer technologies, we are also not the cheapest credits in the market. So if you want to get your quick way out, you buy the cheapest thing.
Yeah.
And because we
I'm
are
sure
not the
lots of people do.
Yeah, and because we are not the cheapest thing, it would be a weird way to greenwash.
Okay, but all right. So should I just purchase the more expensive credits? Is that the way for me to differentiate between the wrong and the right kind of credits, or?
No, not necessarily. But
you're going to provide the transparency into this.
Yeah.
And that's how I decide.
Yeah. So eventually you want your credits to have an impact, and if the credits are inexpensive, that doesn't necessarily say that they are bad.
Yeah.
It doesn't have to be expensive to be good.
They could be great projects.
Yeah. I'm just saying that specifically the type of carbon credits that we have and how they are rewarded in the market at the moment. So the carbon removal credits are, as a group, more expensive than the avoidance credits that we discussed.
Yeah.
So if a company really wants to greenwash and wants to spend just a little money to make some bold claim,
they'll go with the avoidance.
Yeah.
All right.
So you can still, in theory, greenwash with expensive projects, but it's unlikely that you would do so.
Kees, you're building a real business out of this. As a founder, what's your biggest oh shit moment that you've encountered so far?
The biggest oh shit moment was just, I think I was working on Cawa for like a month or so, officially. And I spoke to people in the market already for like the months before that as well. And then a trader called me, so a trader in carbon credits, called me like, hey, we need to have this amount of carbon credits by tomorrow. Do you have that?
Oh.
And I didn't have any.
What amount?
1,000 carbon credits.
So 1,000 tons of CO2.
Yeah.
Right.
Of a specific project range and all quite specific details.
By tomorrow.
Yeah. And basically, if I would have it, I could have sold it to him and I could have made money within a day, right? Yeah. So And I asked, like, okay, who is the end buyer? So which
Right.
company are we doing this for?
Was it Shell?
No, it wasn't. I mean, I don't know.
You don't know. Okay.
Because that was the key thing. Like, this guy also didn't know.
Oh.
Because he was an intermediary
Right. He was in this system.
in this system of intermediaries. And I knew about this problem conceptually, right? That this intermediary buys from intermediary,
Right.
buys from
Right.
intermediary. And now I really saw it firsthand, right? I was in this chain if I would
Right.
have done the transaction.
Right.
And that was for me like, hey, this is not, because we were not an established trader at that time, right? So we were not a big party that you would call for carbon credits. So that was for me the oh shit moment, like, hey, this is actually happening.
Yeah.
And this is how it goes.
Uh-huh.
And this is what we're trying to solve for. Because if I would charge my fee, this guy would charge his fee, and you don't know how many others,
Yeah.
then there's only 10% or 20% of the money going to a climate project eventually.
So
And-
did you do it?
No, I also couldn't do it at that time.
But
But
you didn't. Yeah.
we didn't do it, no.
So it was a turning point for you, like a realization where you thought, okay, I have to solve for this intransparency problem.
Yeah. And we were thinking really more about the consumer perspective before.
Yeah.
So like, okay, as a consumer, you want to know where your money goes.
Right.
And now we actually saw it from like the intermediary perspective. And we saw like, okay, this is how this market works. And this is how a lot of carbon credits are sold and resold and sold to others. So that was a realization for us. And basically like an, oh shit, this is how it goes moment.
So what's next?
Growing Cawa and having more impact.
How can we help with that?
At the moment, as I said, like the main thing that that keeps me up at night, as you asked, is that not enough companies are engaged in the voluntary carbon market.
Right. Funding these projects.
Yeah. So
And there's something material in return for them.
yeah, so eventually companies, like many companies are doing something on sustainability.
Yeah.
Like above a certain threshold of size, like if you're 2 people, you're probably not doing
Right.
really active work on sustainability because you don't have the time. But
You have different issues to deal
yeah,
with.
but at a certain stage of the company, it's really hard to find, especially like in Western Europe, companies that don't do anything on sustainability.
Yeah.
But the initiatives are really like wide in variety, and in many cases not yet super focused.
Mm-hmm.
So what I would like to see, and what we can also help companies with, is to make a sustainability strategy that makes sense,
Yeah.
that is robust,
Yeah.
and that indeed involves eventually carbon credits to compensate for residual emissions, and then really go towards, okay, this is my responsibility as a company, and I am accountable for the carbon footprint that I have.
All right. Well, thank you, Kees, for explaining how this world works. It's been wonderful, like just learning. And I wasn't aware of all the details, so and I'm sure lots of people are unaware. So that's been incredibly helpful. Good luck with that, and I wish you all the best in your endeavors.
Thanks a lot, and thanks for inviting me in this beautiful and now dark forest.
Yeah, sitting in the smoke, feeling the urgency of the problem.
Yeah, definitely.
Right, Kees? Thank you. Cheers.
Thanks.